Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Garrett, and in this one we're going to talk about scope, and we're going to use JavaScript as an example for learning about scope. The first thing that I want to talk about is, what does it actually solve? Like, why does scope exist? So something that I see a lot of tutorials and such kind of skip is the problem that scope actually solves. And I think that's the most important thing, is to understand why the solution of scope actually exists. And the idea here is that scope is simply a tool to minimize complexity in your applications. And let's talk about what I mean by that. So there's this idea of coupling, right? And coupling is basically when a lot of things are, dependent on other things, we can say that these two things are coupled together, right? When they're dependent on one another. And this is fine sometimes, but generally, if you can, you want to try and decouple things to improve the logic and remove the complexity in your code. In this example right here, we can see that we have a variable called radius, and it's equal to 7. And then we have a function that's going to use that radius to return a special button of some kind. And this is totally fine. We then go and we call that function, we save it to a variable called button, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's totally valid that we do this, right? But let's now look at this next example. Things start to get a little bit more complicated. We still have the same radius variable. We still have the same create special button function. But now we have two additional functions. One is create profile button, and the other one is registration button. And they also depend on the radius variable that we set before. However, this time they actually edit the variable. And then when I go to call them at the very bottom of this example, I call create special button last. And what do you think is going to happen? What do you think the value of radius is going to be? Well, pause the video, comment down below. What do you think the value of radius is going to be? If you guess 16, you'd be correct. At this point, the radius is set to 16. And this is not great because now, functions are changing the value of radius, and we don't really know what it's going to be at any given time. It's possible that it might not be what we expect it to be, and that's really bad. So even though it was technically doable to keep this at the top level, the radius variable, it's really not ideal. How can we make this a little bit better? Well, one way that we could do this is we could simply put radius inside of each function. We could declare it inside of each function. That means that it would be declared 3 separate times, once inside of each function, but it would have the correct value. And so you might say to yourself, well, all right, okay, I see what you're saying, but now we have more code, and that's not great. Well, you're right, we do have more code, but more code isn't always bad, because if it results in more maintainable code, which will ultimately be less error prone, then more code is totally fine. Let's talk about the types of scope in JavaScript. So now we've seen, the problem that scope is actually there to solve. We've seen how complexity can increase as we have more things in the highest level of scope. Let's talk about the different types of scope. So the first one is global scope. Now, my understanding is that this isn't really something that you're going to run into if you're running a Node.js application. Now, if you're something in the web browser, React, maybe Angular, Vue, other things like that, you could run into this. We can put things in global scope by having a script tag and then putting a let username equals Garrett inside of that script tag. That we can do. That would then be in global scope. Another way we can do that is we can use the window global object, I think it's called. So window.username equals Garrett. This is now as well in the global scope. And so, again, something that you'll run into in the browser, not so much in Node. We'll talk about highest level of scope in Node in a second. That's what global scope is. It exists kind of at the highest level, and everything in global scope, if it's defined there, it's accessible to every single part of your application. Let's talk about module scope. So if you're working in Node.js or even React, this is what you're going to run into probably most often. So any file that has a .js or TS extension is going to be treated as its own module. And so you could put things at the module scope level, which would be what name here is at the very top, or greet again. These are all in the module scope. But then if we go down one example here, what we'll see, again, rewriting that file, but then moving the name constant into greet. So now it's no longer in module scope, which means that greet again won't be able to access it. If we run greet again, we'll run into a problem, an error. and this is what module scope is. Now, things in module scope, they are accessible to anything else in the file, the module, but they're not accessible to other modules or other files. Now, we could export them. So like in this example here, we can export greet, and then we'll be able to access that function from another module. Now, this isn't really like global scope, but it's sort of similar in the way that we can access it from anywhere. If in fact it is exported, we can just import it and then access it from anywhere else. Let's talk about function scope here. That's the next one down. We actually just saw function scope. So this is the same example from the code above. And name here, we moved into this function, this name constant, we moved into the greet function. And this is now inside of function scope. So function scope is essentially anything within the curly braces of that function. And everything within here can access stuff that's inside of the module scope, but just not the other way around. So that's why greet again can't access name, because name is only defined or declared inside of the greet function. But before, it was able to access name because name was defined inside of the entire module scope. The last one I want to talk about is block scope. And block scope, is pretty interesting because it only works with certain types of variables. So let's take a look at this one here. We can see that let and const, the first name and last name, those are accessible within that block. We create a block just by adding in curly braces. No function, no nothing, just the curly braces. That creates a block within our module, within our file. And actually, I believe this was added in ES6 or ES15. That was like a huge change to JavaScript. I remember when that came out. So yeah, so these ones here are only available or accessible inside of the curly braces or inside of the block. And they're not available outside of it, right? Now, var, however, does not respect block scope. It doesn't know about it, doesn't pay attention to it. So because of that, var is available, it can be accessed inside of the block, but it can also be accessed outside of the block, which is interesting. Now, it's worth noting that even though this is interesting, even though maybe this is useful at some point in time, modern JavaScript doesn't really use var anymore. It really uses let and const. There's some weird stuff with var that, truthfully, I don't really know all that much about. Maybe I'll have to look into that and make another video about it. But yeah, there's some like weird stuff with var that let and const are meant to kind of address. And so they respect block scope, but var does not. And so that's really, I thought, an interesting thing. I didn't actually know that when I was looking into this video. So that's pretty cool though. So in closing, right, there's one really important thing to remember. Scope is simply a tool for managing or reducing complexity inside of your applications, inside of your code. And so it's best to, while you can use the highest level scope that you have available to you to declare things, you can use global scope, you can use module scope, it's best to use the smallest amount of scope possible, because when you do that, you reduce complexity, you make it more easy to manage. It will be easier to reason about where things are coming from, why things are happening, and it will ultimately lead to less bugs in your code. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Again, if you want to check out the links in the description below, if you want to read this content, you can go and do that on Medium, Substack, or Dev Together, or Dev2, however you pronounce that. If you enjoyed, subscribe, like, and comment, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care. See ya.